What do you want?
I want you. It's showtime.
Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Shane with Shane Media. In this video, we're going to talk about Scream 2. Let's get into it. Scream 2 is a 1997 film starring Neve Campbell, David Arquette, Courtney Cox, and is directed by Wes Craven.
It is gonna rock!
So, with 1996's Scream being such a huge success both commercially and with critics and audiences alike, it's no surprise that the studio was in a hurry to pump out a sequel and capitalize on that success as soon as possible. And just 1 year later, in 1997, we got Scream 2. Scream 2 is widely considered to be the best sequel of the entire franchise by many people. I've even seen some people say it's the best in the franchise, period. While I personally wouldn't agree with either of those things, I still agree that it is a very solid sequel when compared to many other franchises and their sequels. More times than not, especially with horror movies, rushed sequels are generally a recipe for disaster. A good example of this would be Halloween 5. Halloween 4 was a pretty well-received movie, and then Halloween 5, just 1 year later, was a complete and total dumpster fire. But despite the issues I have with this movie, and I definitely do have some issues with it, I would say that at the end of the day, we still got a mostly quality film. The first major positive is our returning main cast members. We have our 4 surviving leads of the first movie come back with Sidney, Dewey, Gale, and Randy, as well as a new group of cannon fodder. We even have Liev Schreiber reprising his role as Cotton Weary. Everybody brings their A-game to this movie, and much like the first one, all of these characters have very believable chemistry with each other. Almost to the point where it's almost like they're not acting at times. They just seem like a group of friends who are hanging out, and somebody just happened to catch their interactions on camera. And it helps that there was real-life romantic chemistry going on between Courtney Cox and David Arquette at the time. It helps to digest the side plot with their little on and off relationship drama a little easier, because anytime you throw a side plot pertaining to relationship drama in any movie, but definitely a slasher movie, it can completely take you out of the movie anytime they're on screen if it's not handled correctly. So I think they did a good job with that. In fact, that's a positive I have for all of these movies. Wes Craven really had lightning in a bottle with his casting choices. While Scream is certainly not my favorite franchise, I think you would be hard-pressed to find any horror franchise with a better cast. Another thing I have to give this movie credit for is, much like the first movie, it had a good use of misdirection. I felt like there was a bigger sense of paranoia in this movie, mainly because the events of the first movie already happened, so our characters are already a little more on edge and untrusting than they were previously. And as an audience member, you feel that, and it's almost a claustrophobic feeling. You're not sure who to root for because you're thinking, damn, any one of you guys could be the killer. You become just as untrusting as the characters in the movie, and the exposition that Randy gives Dewey in the film adds to that because he establishes that per sequel rules, any of the main cast could be guilty here. And my last major positive for this film is that it did the sequel thing correctly, in that in some ways it went bigger and upped the stakes. I imagine anyone watching this video has already seen this movie, but just in case, spoiler warning, Randy dies in this film. For a lot of people, myself included, that was pretty hard to take. By this point, you felt like our main cast was immune, and then they pulled the rug out from underneath us with that, and it was pretty sad to see him go. He was one of the most fun aspects of these films. I saw this in theaters as a kid, and I was already a huge fan of the first one, so I'll admit I was a little emotional. Even as a kid, I was pretty emotional when that happened, so a lot of people might even argue that it was a mistake to kill him off, but I personally think it was effective. It even probably needed to happen to add a real sense of dread. Any franchise will lose any serious tension if you go into it knowing the main characters have immunity and can't die. Because let's face it, if you already know it's a horror movie, you're already expecting people to die. So when they just start killing off a bunch of new faces and cannon fodder, it has no emotional impact because you're not emotionally invested in these characters. So if you want your film, especially a sequel, to have a real gut punch, you have to kill off a main character that the fans are attached to. And the fans were definitely attached to Randy. He was the horror fan giving the exposition. He represented us, the audience, so it was effective. But now it's time to move into my negatives, and one big negative is that aside from changing locations and killing a main character, I don't feel like this film expanded on anything else. This movie really didn't justify its existence for me. Scream was a phenomenal movie and worked great as a standalone, so if you're going to give us a sequel to such a great movie, you need to do something to convince us that there was more story to be told. I don't feel like they did that. This entire movie is basically a copy and paste of the first movie. They used the exact same formula as the original Scream. They changed just enough around to make it feel somewhat fresh. This movie just feels completely unnecessary to me. It brings nothing new to the table, and it doesn't expand on the lore, aside from killing off Randy. At least Scream 3 tried to be different. At least it tried to have its own identity. It feels like this movie just tried to piggyback off the first film, but it did it in a lesser way. Right down to even Gail and Dewey's relationship drama. Like I said, they did a good job with it. The chemistry was there. But my only problem with it is that we already saw that in the first movie. And then we see it again in the third movie. Spoiler warning for that video, by the way. But why are we doing that again? I don't know. But when I'm in the mood for a Scream movie or one of its sequels, I almost never, in fact, I literally never find myself wanting to go back and rewatch this movie. And it's not because it's a bad movie. I mean, how could it be? It technically used the same template as the first movie, so on paper, it's a good movie. And as I said, it's by and large a quality made movie. But the problem is, if I'm ever in the mood for that formula, I'm just going to go to the first movie because it did it better. I could be a little more forgiving of that issue if it really knocked it out of the park and impressed me with the things it did right. But unfortunately, it doesn't do anything else good enough for me to excuse it. I watch all of the other Scream movies several times a year because they're easy watches for me if I'm just in the mood for a fun slasher. I haven't watched Scream 2 in probably close to 10 years. I only rewatched it recently to prepare for this review, and now that I have, it'll probably be another 10 years before I ever have any desire to go back and watch it again. And that's just where I'm at with this movie, and for me, that's a pretty glaring flaw. Like I said, it is still technically a good movie. It just feels unnecessary, right down to the killer reveals, which leads me into my next and probably my biggest negative, honestly. Because with any Scream movie, the big fireworks show at the end of each movie is that killer reveal. And again, spoiler warning, other than Mickey, I think the overall execution of the killer reveals was very mundane and boring. And even Mickey wasn't great, but of the two, I would say he was the better one. But Mrs. Loomis's reveal just lacked the gut punch for me because, for one, it was just Pamela Voorhees 2.0. And secondly, there was literally not one single breadcrumb leading up to her being the killer. And it was a little silly because this woman was all over this campus throughout this movie. And she was literally a reporter, so it's not like she was trying to hide from anybody. She was right in front of Sydney this entire time. How did Sydney not notice her up until now? And also the whole concept of her finding Mickey was also just silly. Unless I understood it wrong, didn't she basically say she met him on a serial killer website? If this website was so easy to get into that just anyone, including a single middle-aged woman, can navigate it, then why isn't law enforcement able to navigate it? If Nikki was so easy for her to find, then how come not a single law enforcement agency was able to crack down on this sooner? I get that Scream has always teetered on being a dark comedy, but it still kept things grounded. That literally felt like something that would have been more fitting for the Scary Movie franchise. This may sound petty to you guys, but that was just ridiculous for me and completely took me out of the scene. I felt like it was basically like watching 90s villains from a Disney TV show, but in a Scream movie. It felt very out of place to me. Now for my third and final negative, and this is where you guys are going to think I'm just nitpicking now, but it's the opening scene at the movie theater. On the surface, it's a pretty cool scene, but they definitely had to seriously bend the laws of logic to make this entire scene work. They made it so sensational and exaggerated, and once you start to realize all of the holes and the logic of this scene, it ruins it. It did for me anyways. First of all, I've been to countless theaters and seen multiple movies in multiple states, and I have never seen a theater that allowed the audience to be as belligerent as they were in this movie. There was basically a freaking rave going on right in the theater. No theater would allow that. Period. Secondly, when the boyfriend gets stabbed through the bathroom stall, this scene defies all logic because, I'm sorry, but there's very few people on this entire planet that have the ability to cleanly put a knife through metal like that, especially a middle-aged woman that maybe weighs 120, 130 pounds at best. Nope, I'm not buying it. Honestly, though, I would have probably been more forgiving of these things if they were being done in a more impressive movie. Like I said, it's not a bad movie, but it commits the sin of being boring. And when a movie bores me, I become overly critical and start nitpicking. Now, one thing I've always said and something I'll always stand by is that Scream is probably the most consistent horror franchise I've ever seen. Most of the time, you have a great first movie, but then the sequels start taking a serious dive off a cliff in terms of quality. So, I give credit where it's due, and even the worst Scream movie is leaps and bounds better than the worst movies of some other franchises. In fact, the worst Scream movie might even be better than some of the best movies in some other franchises in terms of the technical side of the actual filmmaking. So, with that being said, despite the issues I do have with this movie, I'm still going to give it a solid 7. But what did you guys think of Scream 2? Did you agree with anything I said? Did you disagree with anything I said? Go ahead and let me know down in the comments section and we can discuss it. But in the meantime, go ahead and like and share this video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and I'll catch you guys in the next one.